Good evening, everybody. I am so excited to be here with you all. Many of you probably know my good friend, Josh Hall, Dean of the Business School at WVU. Before he went back to West Virginia, Josh and I taught together at Beloit College, and he used to always quip that they don't pay me to teach, they pay me to grade. Teaching filled Josh up, and I think that ethos very much defines this gathering and the people who are here. You are all masterful teachers who take great delight in carrying the ideas forward. The other thing you all have in common is that you are liberal educators, and I mean that in both senses of the term. You are committed to the enterprise of liberal learning, and you're committed to the liberal project of a free and open society, made up of self-governing citizens. And I dare to project that you also see the connection between those two things. A liberal education prepares people to be fit for liberty, to deploy curiosity, reasoning, and humility as they navigate a complex and challenging world, to exercise their liberty wisely with both restraint and compassion, and to become capable stewards of the liberal norms and institutions that secures those liberties. Which brings me to the motivation for this evening's talk. Liberalism has given humanity the most reliable foundation yet discovered for peace, freedom, and widely shared prosperity. And we are in real danger of losing that foundation. You all don't need me to catalog the long list of overt threats. And Siri Turgeson, this next line is for you. In 1776, Thomas Paine observed, in the American crisis, these are the times that try men's souls. Looking past the last 2 months, Minneapolis, Venezuela, Greenland, we have a sense as to what Paine was talking about. But in addition to these overt threats to the liberal order is what I like to call the great forgetting, when the principles that sustain a free society become so familiar, become so well-worn that they start to fade from view. When these principles are in good working order, we tend not to notice their presence. And when they're significantly compromised, many of our fellow citizens struggle to explain, defend, and some openly reject what once seemed to be self-evident. That is the danger of the present moment, not only that our constitutional order is under direct attack by people who swore an oath to defend it, but that our civic imagination so often struggles to resist that attack. It is the great forgetting that makes your work as liberal educators, as professors, as intellectual mentors so vital. The question is, how do we make visible the principles that sustain the liberal order so that the next generation have the opportunity to become capable stewards of the liberal project, so that a free and open society is secure for generations to come? In this, part of the challenge is to make visible the formal rules, the bones of the liberal project, more visible. Yet it is also a soft tissue problem. The values, norms, and habits that make the formal rules work. The soft tissue problem is especially important to address because it's the soft tissue of values and norms and habits that holds the whole thing together. Formal rules can be written on a page, but unless they're written on our hearts also, we're going to have a pretty tough time enforcing them. And unlike formal rules of the game, once habits, norms, and values have been degraded, there's no legislative remedy to restore them. If we are to reverse the great forgetting, we need to understand how the soft tissue of liberalism actually works, how ideas, norms, and networks interact with each other, and also the formal rules of the game to produce either liberal resilience or liberal decay. For that, I'll draw on a framework that Virgil Storr and I developed that grew out of our research on community rebound and recovery in the wake of catastrophic disaster. The idea behind this approach is to offer a cultural economy framework that complements a political economy framework. Let's start by building a visual representation. First, it's important to recognize that a cultural economy framework begins with political economy, okay? As with political economy, cultural economy recognizes the formal institutions that govern human interaction. By institutions, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I don't mean organizations or agencies, I mean the rules of the game, such as rights of property and contract, constitutional guarantees, and other political and legal rules that govern our interactions with one another and with the state. And just like political economy, cultural economy aims to understand how those rules of the game drive both individual and social outcomes. Individual outcomes like health, literacy, lifespan, economic mobility, and other human development indicators, and social outcomes like patterns of economic development and social and cooperation and cohesion. And both political economy and cultural economy recognizes that those outcomes in turn have influence on institutional rules of the game. Patterns of successful economic performance, for example, tend to strengthen and reinforce legal frameworks that have us respecting one another's property, entering into and honoring contractual obligations, and so on. In turn, those strengthened institutions of property and contract expand markets and drive even further economic performance, better economic performance. Additionally, cultural economy also focuses on the social terrain that governs human interactions beyond the market, legal, and political sphere. For example, customs of kinship can shape patterns of resource allocation, both in terms of the material resources, but also non-material resources, like social capital and social status, that represent real value to those people who have access to them. In other words, there's a lot going on in this middle space between institutional rules of the game and the patterns of performance. An entrepreneur might rely on formal institutions to gain access to financial capital, to be sure, but she may also rely on resources embedded within informal networks of kinship, ethnicity, gender, social status, and so on. And in turn, those informal networks generate norms of obligation and reciprocity that can influence, in both positive and negative ways, social and economic outcomes. And those patterns of performance can, in turn, influence the formal rules of the social game. And it's this middle space of socially embedded resources that I want to unpack this evening. As Virgil and I developed the framework, we focused on 4 dimensions of social life that define the opportunities and constraints that shape strategies for purposeful behavior. These categories, shared mental models, generalized norms, cultural tools, and social networks, are not exhaustive. Instead, these emerged as the most relevant factors in the puzzles we were trying to solve at the time. But the upshot is this: cultural economy research helps us to understand the connections between culturally embedded resources and patterns of social and economic performance. And for my purposes this evening, it also helps us to understand the inner workings of liberalism. in a way that helps us to see liberalism working as a coherent system of both formal rules and informal norms, habits, and values. Let's dive into the shared mental models first, which draws from insights from new institutionalist thinkers like Douglass North. Shared mental models are theoretical frameworks that help us to make sense of the world. Mental models can be highly refined and well articulated, like the Pythagorean theorem is a mental model, or they can be more general, like the inherited wisdom that says patience is rewarded. In either case, there's a theory of the world at work. The theory may be operating in the front of one's mind, like the geometry student struggling to solve for the length of the hypotenuse, or it may operate in the background, like the general sense that patience tends to yield better outcomes than impulsiveness. Social coordination depends, of course, on the formal rules underlying the liberal order, but these rules persist. They are sticky because people hold certain theories of the world in their head. Liberalism's most basic mental model is that every one of us is endowed with dignity just by virtue of the fact that we are human. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Obviously, at the time these moments were committed to parchment, we still had a lot to learn about how universally applicable this mental model was, but the contours of the model were there. There are certainly other mental models at work within a liberal society. Distributed power is safer than concentrated power. Innovation, industry, and trade makes nations wealthier, not plunder. Intellectual freedom surfaces truth better than imposed consensus. Tolerated difference fosters peace more reliably than enforced conformity. The rule of law protects liberty far better than the rule of men. Again, some people embrace these mental models as articulated arguments that have stood the test of human experience. Others adopt them unconsciously as inherited wisdom. Either way, the formal rules of ordered liberty endure in part because specific mental models lend these rules an intuitive appeal of both moral fairness and practical workability. And that brings us into the terrain of generalized norms, the behavioral and attitudinal defaults that guide our interactions with others. We keep promises and we expect others to do the same. We offer small kindnesses to strangers, not because we expect that specific person will return the favor, but because we expect that somebody would do the same for us if we found ourselves in similar circumstances. Generalized norms can flow directly from explicit articulated mental models or from the fact that we're just simply born in a context of generalized reciprocity that has us offering help to someone in need. When it comes to default behaviors, most of the time we don't do the cost-benefit analysis. We just follow the habits of a given place and community. Social capital research informs this terrain and underscores that generalized norms can represent genuine resources that help us to get things done, as James Coleman observed in his classic essay. Behavioral norms among Jewish merchants in the New York Diamond District, he observed, minimized fraud, lowered transactions costs, and extended the reach of a hyper-local marketplace across the globe. Though the constellation of generalized norms will vary across time and across cultures, liberal societies tend toward particular clusters of behavioral norms. Norms like toleration and forbearance, cooperation over predation, fair dealing over extractive behavior. And with each of these norms, we can connect the dots back to liberal rules of the game. In robust liberal societies, we refrain from engaging in predatory behavior because we expect that there will be legal consequences for doing so. But generalized norms go well beyond mere compliance with legal constraints. We cooperate. We engage in good faith. We look for win-win opportunities and refrain from extractive behavior because it accords with our moral intuitions. And it's not simply a matter of personal virtue, it's a social expectation too. We expect that others will also refrain from predatory and extractive behavior. And it's this mutual expectation that renders the liberal order a cooperation game, even in highly competitive contexts. There's a lot more I can say about the role that generalized norms plays in a liberal society, but for my purposes this evening, the most relevant feature of generalized norms is their automaticity. Because they are behavioral defaults, generalized norms work fast. And if those defaults are liberal defaults, we're much more likely to engage in behavior conducive to the extended order, such as engaging in market transactions with strangers. The more accustomed we become to relying on the productivity and the promises of strangers, the more we feel comfortable specializing in our own pursuits, which in turn makes us much more alert to opportunities for innovation within our own spheres of expertise, extending the market order even further. And when generalized norms become second nature, when they become essentially the right thing to do, the more likely we are to overcome temptations of transactional gamesmanship that would have us violating pro-social norms for short-term gain. And all this automaticity and stickiness creates a kind of scale effect for the institutional rules that they support. As we learn from Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, when moral constraints have become so internalized that we follow them without thinking, external monitoring becomes less necessary, thereby lowering the costs of rule enforcement. As the costs of rule enforcement drop, the benefits of those rules, such as more peaceful trade and less predatory behavior, become all the more widespread. So in short, liberal norms scale the impact of our shared mental models, which further strengthens liberal institutions. Cultural tools may be a little less familiar with this crowd. They represent a category of socially embedded resources too. Here, I'm building off of work of cultural sociologists like Ann Swidler, who draw attention to the link between cultural resources and human agency. The idea here is that we're not merely recipients of culture, we can also be active practitioners of culture. In Swidler's framing, this is particularly true in unsettled times, where we're more likely to take notice of and actively deploy in tool-like fashion the cultural tools at our disposal. For example, historical narratives or collective stories of who we are as a community or as a country. These get noticed with fresh eyes in these unsettled times and strategically deployed toward a particular outcome. As Michaela Novak and I argue, cultural tools have played a particularly important role in the widening of liberal emancipation. Consider, for example, the unsettled times of 1852, when Frederick Douglass gave his famous Independence Day speech, "What to a slave is the 4th of July," to leading citizens in Rochester, New York. Douglass knew what the crowd expected of him, to laud the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Instead, he spoke of the hypocrisy of celebrating American liberty while 4 million Black Americans remained in chains. Rather than celebrating the country's liberty, he called out the great sin and shame of American slavery as hideous and revolting. In his oratory, Douglass leveraged the common cultural touchstone, an Independence Day celebration, to link the abolitionist cause to what it means to be American. In his I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. also leveraged America's founding narratives. When the architects of our republic, he said, created our founding documents, they were, quote, signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir, a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King's audience had assembled at the Lincoln Memorial to, in his words, cash a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. By recognizing the anger and frustration of that crowd, this line earned hearty acclamation. King warned that a rude awakening would follow if that anger were dismissed. But within the space of just a few minutes, he moved from the anger and the despair of a promise unfulfilled and values betrayed to the dream. A dream, he observed, that is deeply rooted in the American dream, the dream that our country will rise up to live out the true meaning of its founding creed, that we will hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Conjoined with Judeo-Christian references to universal brotherhood and the call and response cadence of the Black church, King artfully deployed the cultural tools at his disposal to issue a challenge. If we as Americans believe what we say we believe, we must join together in the struggle for civil rights peacefully and in a spirit of brotherhood. And as he closed out his presidency, Ronald Reagan picked up the cultural tool of Lady Liberty to pointedly remind his fellow conservatives what it is that makes America truly great. Quoting from a letter he'd received, "You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." He continued, "Liberty is what makes ours a great and special place. It's what breathes life into dreams. It's what creates the future. And it's the bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity, who leave everything behind, who believe most deeply in the American dream." The point I want to make here is that liberal societies, especially those with collective and varied stories of who we are and why we have a special stake in a free society, have a well-stocked cultural toolkit from which to draw. Social networks. These too are resources embedded within the cultural fabric. Think of the work by Mark Granovetter, for example, the Strength of Weak Ties thesis, and the cascade of research it inspired, including the Strength of Strong Ties thesis. Social networks can be a source of material support for childcare, elder care, a social safety net, and they can provide pathways for economic and social mobility. Along with generalized norms of trust and reciprocity, social networks form the fabric of a civil society that gets things done. The art of association is practiced not by isolated individuals, but by and within neighborhoods, congregations, sports clubs, activist groups, volunteer organizations, arts communities, and so on. As we learn from Tocqueville, from Dick Cornell, from Eleanor Ostrom, and many of the folks assembled here tonight, civil society is a cornerstone of a liberal order because it is an arena in which problems get solved beyond the orchestrating hand of the state and alongside the commercial motivations of the marketplace. Now I'm going to zoom back out here a bit. And I want to draw attention to something I've already hinted at. The interaction effects across these categories, as suggested by the double-headed arrows. A mental model of universal human dignity will shape generalized norms that favor respect and equal treatment, not just in our politics, but in our social interactions as well. In turn, those defaults, those norms, if practiced regularly, will tend to broaden circles of trust, expanding who we include in our social networks. And that expanded view of who counts as us has us interacting with people who come from different places, hold different beliefs, and so on. And those experiences can in turn strengthen a mental model of universal human dignity in a virtuous reinforcing cycle. Another example. A narrative of resilience. For example, a historical narrative of survival through war or persecution may get picked up and used as a cultural tool within a community facing some kind of overwhelming challenge, like rebuilding in the aftermath of a catastrophic disaster. If such efforts are successful, that experience may strengthen a mental model that says challenging times can be overcome if we work together. That mental model may in turn strengthen norms of association, lending resilience to the community the next time a challenge presents itself. Now, it's important to say that none of this is guaranteed, right? But I will say that in the research that Virgil and I pursued, we found in post-disaster recovery environments, these virtuous cycles of mutual reinforcement can directly drive successful social outcomes that no one intended or designed. Unfortunately, though, not all cycles are virtuous ones. The interaction effects can also work in the opposite direction. When a high-influence political or cultural player violates liberal norms brazenly and with relentless frequency, when they flood the zone with excrement, they can shift the Overton window of what's considered inbounds within the public sphere. Incivility and intolerance become the defaults. These degraded norms harden the boundaries of our social networks into tribalist factions. That tribalism, in turn, promotes illiberal narratives of who we are, blood and soil notions of who counts as us. Those hardened identities amplify mental models that have us blaming them for everything that's wrong with the world, further degrading liberal norms of civility and toleration. On top of these exogenously imposed vicious cycles, there's also the endogenous one, the great forgetting that I referenced at the top of my remarks. When a liberal society becomes so accustomed to the fruits of ordered liberty that it runs on autopilot, liberal mental models become so well worn that they fade from deliberate thought and discourse. When this happens, democratic norms respecting the rule of law, press freedoms, an independent judiciary, and so on, can too easily wane because we've lost the capacity to recognize threats and to effectively defend the liberal order against those threats. It's under these conditions that authoritarian norms become, normalized. We're more likely to lean on cultural narratives of power and dominance as the principal pathway to solve our problems of public concern, further eroding liberal mental models that emphasize persuasion and liberty over coercion. Again, I want to emphasize that there are very real upsides to the autopilot effect of liberal norms and defaults. It is not the police car on the corner or the cold calculus of cost and benefit that leads most people to cooperate rather than to predate. It is the internalized liberal sensibility that removes predatory behavior from the menu of options right at the get-go. Yet the auto-response that lends scale and resilience to liberal institutions can also be the seeds of complacency. When we forget that these behavioral defaults were hard-won through human history and require continued vigilance, we risk losing them, not necessarily through outright rejection, but because we assume they will always be there, even when we fail to deploy them consistently. And when crisis hits, the public is left without a clear, well-specified mental model from which to resist illiberal drift. And here I want to be clear. This is not a partisan problem. It's a human problem. Even if the nationalist right does not prevail in upcoming midterm and the national elections, if authoritarian principles and impulses are still normalized, liberalism loses. Arguably, the current threats are pulling us out of the great forgetting, but I'm worried about what lessons will come of it. And as we've seen so frequently, when liberal arguments come out of the mouths of those who have violated those principles when it suited them to do so, they have no credibility to be taken seriously. My point is not to engage in a who's to blame. I suppose if we go back far enough, a case is to be made on either side of the conventional political divide. But I want to say, and I say this with emphasis, that is not the point. There are myriad and complex reasons for why we are here, but we're here. The question now is what to do about it. In a moment when we seem to be spiraling into a vicious cycle of decay, how do we begin to reverse the spin toward liberal renewal? How do we reverse the great forgetting? Some of that work is squarely in the realm of political economy, reforms to restore the balance of powers, to close gaping holes in emergency authority, to assert the constitutional checks designed to prevent the centralization of control. And that work requires liberal argument based on reason and evidence. Clearly, evidence-based reasoning is not going to change the minds of autocrats, but it can shift mental models of thought leaders who are well-positioned to drive reform. And so many in this room are already doing that work in your scholarship, as public policy advisors, and as public intellectuals, with the appropriate sense of urgency. In addition to reform efforts, though, the people in this room have an especially important role to play as liberal educators. To make liberal mental models visible to the next generation, to interrogate those theories of the world, to pressure test them against alternatives. By naming the mental models, the generalized norms, the civic connections that make a free society work, we help students see themselves within it. As bad as things are, these unsettled times do offer an opportunity to renew the liberal project. Students want to understand the world that they're in. They want to understand the moment that they're living through. And you have a superpower. And it's not actually your training. Your superpower is that you can make students care about the stakes. Of course, you will present liberal arguments, but you can also deploy liberal cultural tools, our symbols, our stories, our founding ideals, not reluctantly, not defensively, but with conviction and with skill. In contexts where intellectual sophistication matters, we so often refrain from flexing these tools. A full-throated affirmation of constitutional principles can make us sound like we've just walked out of a 10th grade civics class. Especially in academic environments, praising the founding is construed as being blind to its egregious inconsistencies. But I encourage you to be bold nonetheless. While liberal principles can be grasped by any reasonably capable 10th grader, the principles don't apply themselves. The world keeps offering up new challenges, and the liberal path, the freedom-preserving path, the freedom-enhancing path, is not always obvious. Every generation needs to figure out how to apply liberal principles to the wicked problems we face. And they need help along the way. And for most of your students, there's no other person in their life other than you to provide that help. And to colleagues who say that the liberal project was tainted right from the start, we need to persuasively remind that the value proposition of liberalism is not that it arrives on the scene fully formed. The value prop of liberalism is that it has an inbuilt capacity for self-correction, including self-correction that leads to emancipatory progress. So I submit as a modest proposal that in your capacity as liberal educators, you reclaim the stories that will inspire a new generation, stories of emancipation, of dissent, of pluralism protected under law. By deploying the cultural tools of liberal society, your distinctive contribution is to shine a light on the structure of liberal life that otherwise tends to be hidden from view. Liberal educators like you have the power to reveal how respect for the dignity of all people, civility, trust, even among strangers, reciprocity, and yes, a degree of reverence for democratic norms, the things we so often take for granted, are in fact fundamental. Rather than mere ornaments, liberal norms, cultural touchstones, and theories of the world are the sinew that allow the bones of the liberal order to work as a resilient system. And I will close with this one further thought. At a moment when so much hangs in the balance, we may doubt whether our work matters. When we see liberal norms torn down one after the other, it is very easy to despair. Many times I've asked myself the question, once the toothpaste of liberal norms is squeezed out of the tube, how the hell do we get it back in? No satisfying answer has yet to come back. So I changed the metaphor. While others flood the zone with excrement, we're going to flood the zone with light. The light of wisdom that comes from committed liberal intellectuals advancing the ideas of a free and open society with the people who matter most, the next generation of self-governing citizens. It's in dark times that this light will shine all the more brightly. Every argument that contributes to the glow matters. Every mind opened and changed matters. And when the work feels lonely and exhausting, remember to look up. Lean across the table, literally, to the people in this room. Catch their light and bring it forward. Keep lighting the spark, one curious mind at a time. Thank you for allowing me to share in the light and the wisdom that you create every single day in what I believe to be the most important job in the world. Thank you for being a part of this conference. Thank you especially for being part of the IHS community. We literally could not do anything without you. Thank you very much.